Good morning. Today we have this session about atheism with a lecture by colleague Lois in video conference and with two discussants, Irena Borowik and Philippe Portier. Are you ready, colleague? Can you begin your lecture?
Okay, great. Good. Well, thank you. Thanks for your help. And thanks to all the organisers and funders of this event, especially Roberto Cipriani, of course, but who is such an inspiring sociologist and a generous host. So I'm very sorry to not be able to enjoy all those benefits by being there. I have young children who are always ill, and this week was no exception. The whole household was ill, so I'm happy to have spared you from the bugs we are carrying, but very sorry to not be there in person. A real disappointment, but wonderful to be able to join you in some form. I'm really pleased. I cannot see who's in the room, but I know it's an early start, so thank you everyone for coming, everyone's made it at 9 a.m. in Italy, 8 a.m. where I am. Okay, so atheism and non-religious worldviews. So to begin, let me just keep an eye on the time as well. So we were asked to avoid excessive conceptual and methodological reflection in these conversations in our chapters, and I fear my paper does that. So I just opened my email to send Roberto my slides. I'm going to close that so it's not pinging at you as I talk. There we go. There we go. So, but my paper, I think, does veer into the methodological and conceptual, perhaps more than most. In my defence, I do think a reflection on atheism in the world today must begin by recognising that there is no such thing as an atheist tradition per se, certainly not in the sense that we're used to thinking about a tradition in terms of Christianity, Confucianism, and so on and so forth. Now, all traditions have their complexities, divisions, and schisms. I don't mean to deny that. But I'm not sure that we can plausibly consider, hopefully you see my next slide now, such diverse experiences and traditions as these forms of atheism we find in the world, such as atheist traditions within religions, such as those that are normally referred to as secular Judaism, so-called atheist religions such as Jainism, perhaps Buddhism, with all the complexities there, post-Christian humanisms associated with figures such as Richard Dawkins, or the political atheisms of communist China. I'm not sure we can consider all of these as denominations, as it were, of a common atheist tradition. And that's not to mention the many forms of alternative spirituality that we were discussing yesterday, several of which are atheistic too. So does it make sense even to group these together in, for example, one talk or one chapter? I'm going to limit my discussion today in various ways, but it's helpful to consider this diversity when we consider how we engage with and beyond atheism. There are, of course, various points of cultural connection and exchange between many of these examples, but the discrepancies between them is significant too, and there's certainly no clear common ancestor. As I'll discuss, I think the idea of there being an internal coherence to the category atheism really derives from a theist-centred, a religion-centred way of thinking that in fact secularization theory has upheld and which are, I think, just now being challenged. So from the outset, I do think the conceptual issues surrounding atheism require our attention, as do the conceptual questions associated with it. What, if anything, is atheism? What, if anything, is atheism as a social phenomenon, and one that might justify its place in a forum such as this one? But this beginning isn't to deny the gains I think we make by including atheism in a programme like this one today. I was really delighted to be invited to speak to you, not only to be part of a discussion that I'm sure has been very rich. I haven't been able to participate in as much of it as I wanted to earlier in the week, but have had a sense of that when I was able to join yesterday. But also because the inclusion of atheism at all marks a really important conceptual shift, not only in how we think about atheism, but how we think about religion and the kind of existential and ethical dimensions of human life and culture, and of course their impact on society. So we're reflecting in this meeting on the half century that's passed since the Vatican hosted its remarkable and unprecedented symposium on the culture of unbelief. I've put the cover of the volume that I have, my own book, there to see, and that brought together. Hello, is there someone speaking in the room? No, okay. Brought together such diverse luminaries. Sorry, I thought you were trying to get my attention. Such diverse luminaries as sociologists Peter Berger, Thomas Luckman, Talcott Parsons, I think a very young Roberto, and not to mention Audrey Hepburn and the Pope, of course. And I think what I like about the cover of the collection that I've put up is this sort of wonderful illustration of both the conceptual achievement and the conceptual limitations of that moment. So unbelief is here for the first time, given some attention, but it is at the same time an appendage to the normal business of discussion, religious belief. So that un is being hammered into the word. When the Vatican hosted its symposium in 1969 on the culture of unbelief, it was path-breaking, and it marked engagement with an alternative to conventional religious identity and practice that really was without precedent. Atheism's inclusion in today's forum, though, I think honours that achievement, but it's a marker of change in the 50 intervening years that it has a place at the table. It's not an appendage to the programme, it's part of it. In the past decade or so, we've seen that shift across sociology, and that shift speaks to both changes in the religious landscape itself, quote unquote, is it religious landscape with atheism in it? Those changes being, of course, the growth of atheist populations, but also just as significant changes in how we think about this landscape in sociology and beyond. Atheism is somehow a part of it, but how is it a part of it? I'm going to draw attention today to the further sociological gains, I think, that can be made by reconceptualising our interest as one that is in not so much atheism as non-religious worldviews. And this is a move that's become necessary, firstly because the sociology of atheism has resulted in us understanding non-religious worldviews more roundly, not just as matters of unbelief, which the term atheism also indicates, but of identities, practices and social relations, which these set of snapshots is intended to nod to indicate, not just in terms of unbelief, but of cultures and traditions. This move is necessary because the study of atheism has contributed to a shifting centre at the sociology of religion, so significant that attempts are being made to rebuild it around a new centre, I think. It's therefore a shift we can plausibly see not just as one of theory, but potentially of paradigm, perhaps the realisation of that long promised reconfiguration of the secularisation paradigm into something new. And I take up Grace Davie's use of the term paradox in her thinking, in her recent thinking around secularisation, here to emphasise that the change is not about most of the processes described as secularisation theory. Those, as Davie says quite rightly, continue to proceed. But while they do so, the theories run aground. And I think the issue is that secularisation theory is perversely religion-centred, concerned with the vitality or the decline of religion in different domains. And that means that it's ill-equipped to help us understand the non-religious and atheist societies that are increasingly common. So my home in the UK, where I've conducted much of my research, has recently become an atheist majority country, for example, and non-affiliates have outnumbered affiliates since 1993. So what's emerging as a new framework that includes but isn't limited to religion in the old way? So I'm going to begin just focusing on atheism and how the sociology of atheism has helped us move beyond atheism itself, and then think back to how we think might move beyond religion. as well. So how can we think about global atheisms in terms of worldview? Well, historically, sociology has tended to confuse atheism as a general category, so that's small a atheism, with atheism as a historic form, so closely associated in our thinking, I think, with humanism or secularism is the preferred term, especially in the US literature. Both of these are sort of big A atheisms. And I think we've lacked some reflexivity about this. James Beckford pointed in his 2010 presidential address at the Society for the Scientific Study of Religion that genealogical and discursive approaches explored in such depth in critical secular studies and post-secular approaches and elsewhere have had much less of an impact on the study of non-religion and atheism. And in recent years, I think the kind of dramatic show-stopping outputs of big A atheists in the form of the new atheism, those buses on the streets that some of you may have seen, has been a distraction and implied that small A atheism is in a way kind of more interesting than it is. Emerging from this, though, the sociology and anthropology of non-religious atheisms of any kind frequently indicate that atheism is actually an expression of something else, of worldviews that don't so much reject belief in God, though some do, but within which belief in or experience of God is simply not salient or relevant. So some examples of this approach for Joseph Baker and Buster Smith, their study of a group they call the seculars in the US, leads to an appreciation of their what they call diverse cosmic meaning systems. For Anne Taves, thinking deeply about the non-religious people, set her on a journey towards a newly theorized idea of worldview, which she shaped in conversation with diverse collaborators and evolutionary ways of thinking about and beyond religion. So her worldviews address big questions. I've put those on the screen there. And then for me, the empirical study of non-religious populations, including non-religious atheists, has led to an attempt to recognise the existential as a broad category of social life, equivalent to the political, the industrial, and so on, and then capable, I hope, for including religious and alternatively spiritual modes of existentiality alongside the so-called atheistic. This existentiality concerns in my work conceptualizations of human existence. So how humans conceptualize their existence and therefore existence in general. And when I say conceptualizations, I have in mind those conceptualizations might be manifest in ideas, but also in diverse symbolic forms, bodies, ritual, emotion, social relations, structure, and so on. Davie sees belief and unbelief as two sides of a coin in which, to quote, exactly the same factors that account for the nature of religious belief in European society are equally present in unbelief. And this sense of cultural connection and exchange, I think, is exactly the right one, and what the sociology of atheism is increasingly pointing to. And I think we can elaborate from this metaphor, which keeps that binary form, that coin, to a much more multifaceted way of thinking about those worldviews when we take a worldview or existential approach. In the central research project of the Understanding Unbelief programme, which I led in recent years, we are, for example, learning about the diverse forms of existential meaning and value associated with atheistic and agnostic populations, including the way in which non-believers' meaning systems have at least as much in common with the meaning systems of believers in their country as they do with the meaning systems of non-believers elsewhere. So I've put one example on the screen. I hope you can see that. And it's just to indicate these are items on a extensive survey that we conducted in that research, and it shows the 6 countries that we looked at, comparing unbeliever populations, so-called, and general populations. And all I want you to note here is that the biggest movement in most cases is between countries rather than between believers and unbelievers. So the idea there's some universal or anything, a universal hollowness to atheism in itself doesn't seem to bear out. We're seeing that kind of cultural richness and points of exchange between believers and unbelievers. That's a crude, but I think kind of clear way of indicating that. As a result of all this empirical social scientific research into the lives of non-religious atheists, then all of these approaches decenter the atheism of atheists. They say what matters is not the theism that atheists are not experiencing, but the alternative existential experiences that they are having, the alternative existential traditions that they are a part of, and are producing and reproducing and transforming. And that insight, of course, builds on earlier work, Ninian Smart's work on worldview in the later 20th century, or the study of humanism, existentialism, or romanticism, perhaps especially in history and across the humanities. And the recentering of our area of sociology also builds on the spiritual turn of the decades kind of preceding, sort of overlapping and preceding the growth of non-religious studies in the past decade, which began that process of decentering religion by asking that it share the centre ground with alternative, subjective and individualised forms of spiritualities that were being discussed yesterday. I think in many ways, what's coming out of the study of atheism and non-religion is an extension of that work and kind of bringing it to, well, I was going to say to a natural conclusion, but we don't want to think of conclusions in the spirit of inquiry, do we? The next step. So non-religious worldviews around the world, what does this mean for answering the questions put to us for this forum? To provide a sociological overview of atheism or indeed non-religious worldviews? Well, I think it means answering that question is necessarily going to be made in a moment of transition. We have to draw on data that focuses on atheism and agnosticism to answer the question, but we can look towards learning more about, and are increasingly learning more about, those non-religious worldviews and specifying what they are and what we mean by them. So the study of atheism is a simplification, but it's what we can sort of say most about. So firstly, in terms of general historical details on the origin and development of atheism, well, we know that there have always been lives lived without God, to paraphrase Callum Brown's definition of atheism. Atheism in its quite what we call the negative sense has probably existed throughout human history, and positive atheism, so affirmations of non-belief, is visible in the historical record and intellectual thought in the ancient period, and then growing in scale and prominence in the modern period in many parts of the world, especially in the 20th and 21st centuries. For example, we see in this period the right to be atheist being fought, so those political debates developing. So in the UK, for example, the first member of parliament was able, the first atheist member of parliament was able, after a long battle, to take their seat in 1886, which compares, for example, with Jews who were able to sit in parliament from 1858 and Catholics a couple of decades before that. In the US, the inclusion of non-believers alongside, to quote, Christians and Muslims, Jews and Hindus in Barack Obama's inaugural address in 2009 was a significant moment of political and national inclusion. And of course, this history of atheism is significant in many ways, discursively, theologically, or for cognitive and psychological approaches to what it means to be religious. Sociologically, though, I think atheism is most significant as an object of study when we think about discourse, but also how it's bound up with wider existential traditions. And then there are several of those, and that would require several histories. These are the what are called worldviews and systems that are included in the Oxford Handbook to Atheism, published in 2013. So you can see those there: humanism, existentialism, Marxism, analytic philosophy, Jewish atheism, Buddhism, and Hinduism. And even if we limit our interest to those that we identify as non-religious in this list, still these diverse atheist worldviews couldn't easily be compiled together into a single history. I don't think I could recount any sort of meaningful history of these in a short talk like this. And of course, that list is not exhaustive. And it also predates more recent approaches which question and upend these top-down approaches to worldview that begin with our histories of philosophy, our histories of thought, our histories of literature. Put a quote from Anne Taves and colleagues she's worked with exploring this. So she's arguing that we need to upend our approaches to worldviews for viewing, in these words, Ante's words, lived or enacted worldviews as prior to rationalised or systematised worldviews. Why should we assume that the highly developed and systematised worldviews of philosophers and theologians are the standards for which lived worldviews have departed? But let's say a bit. So much interest in atheism today is really an interest in Western humanism, exclusive humanism in Charles Taylor's language. Humanism is a human-centered cosmology which centers human achievements and human capacities, especially of rational thought and the scientific method, as well as the autonomy and the autonomy and individual responsibility, autonomy of individuals and individual responsibility in moral questions. Contrasting portraits of humanism have emerged in existing accounts, and to the best of my knowledge, rigorous attempts to measure and describe humanist populations statistically haven't been undertaken. Censuses suggest that few people identify as humanists in any country. In many settings, humanist organisations battle to be recognised as culturally significant and deserving of a place of parity alongside religious organisations. And the long and ongoing nature of these battles implies that there are many who reject the idea that they deserve that place or they warrant that place. Humanism is the ideology of New Atheism, an influential non-religious movement originating in the UK and the US in the mid-noughties, but extending its influence around the world, and which attracted much academic attention. Linda Woodhead uses New Atheist figure head Richard Dawkins as her measure of the secular, the Dawkins indicator, she says. And using this measure, she finds that there are very few secular people in the UK. So nearly 2 decades on from its first appearance, popular and academic interest in New Atheism itself seems to have waned. On the other hand, historians see the development of humanism as closely bound up with modernisation processes in many countries, and critical secular accounts, such as those of Talal Azad, Webb Keen, Savon Mahmood, identify a secular humanist ideological regime that's far-reaching, if not encompassing, in the regions of its jurisdiction. So we have these very different portraits of what's going on in terms of humanism in societies around the world. This portrait of the humanist secular is, says Charles Hirschkind, the sea that we swim in. In sociology, Callum Brown argues, in the UK at least, that a humanistic culture has that's what's displaced Western Christianity. Research exploring the outlooks and experiences of atheist children in the UK suggests that humanist ethics are prevalent in childhood, that they're cultivated in children by parents and especially teachers and in educational cultures. And this work also demonstrates how Christmas has been transformed for these populations from a Christian festival into a ritual filled with humanist meaning, and even operating as a rite of passage in which age shapes how individuals engage in and practice Christmas. And children kind of move into maturity through a reflexive process of becoming rational thinkers, non-believers in Father Christmas or Santa Claus, and coming to understand and learning to inhabit the empiricist episteme that's associated with humanism. Research in other settings, wider research, is clearly much needed, but existential orientations are today significantly resourced and developed through media, the existential terrain in Amanda Lagovitz's phrase, and those terrain are globalized and transnational. In this context, it's likely that these bits that we learn and think about humanist doctrine, beliefs and values and rituals at least suggest there may be echoes or comparable experiences and phenomena going on in other places in the world. One tradition not explored in the Oxford Handbook to Atheism, and which was raised yesterday, is Romanticism. Charles Taylor sits humanism alongside Romanticism as one of the 2 main forms of what he terms unbelief. Romanticism is not a term that I think has particularly resonated in sociology, but maybe I'm wrong. Maybe it's in my area, so it's been engaged with much more in relation to alternative spirituality. That was interesting to reflect on yesterday. But certainly social research indicates the global significance of agnostic worldviews, so a form of kind of deep skepticism that resists existential explanation, venerates the unknown, and indeed the total unknowability of the nature of existence, and echoes romanticism in these respects at least, not necessarily the individualism, though. Statistical methods for understanding this orientation are also underdeveloped. There's lots of work underway, but qualitative and quantitative studies indicate that widely used measures of strong agnosticism can provide some insight here. So this is the commonly asked question. It's the ISSP's question, belief question, which provides several statements asking respondents about their beliefs in God, and includes a strong agnostic answer, that the second one, number 2 there. I don't know whether there is a God, and I don't believe there's any way to find out, alongside the kind of positive atheist one, I don't believe in God. So data arising from those surveys show, for example, that in the UK, agnostics outnumbered atheists in 2008, with atheists slightly overtaking them in 2018, the next time those data were gathered, and that agnosticism is the normal and normative form of belief in Japan and deeply ingrained in its existential traditions and cultures. These are some slightly small, but again, I'll tell you what I want you to take from these data. So this is an image from the large study I conducted with colleagues, Understanding Unbelief, looking at atheists and agnostics around the world, and we worked in Brazil, China, Denmark, Japan, UK, and the US, and we found that atheists have fewer supernatural beliefs than agnostics, who have fewer supernatural beliefs than the general population in turn, but that both populations have national distinctions too. So this is showing the beliefs of agnostics and how those vary. There are some slight trends across all agnostic populations, but there's a lot of variety too, and you need to understand that as part of our kind of more detailed, nuanced picture of agnosticism. Agnostics in the UK and the US are the least sure of the 3 populations we have here, the atheist, the agnostic, and general populations, that their beliefs about God are the right ones. But in Denmark and Japan, they're the most confident. In China and the UK, agnostics are more likely to be drawn to belief in fate and underlying forces of good and evil, that was on the last slide, in the world than they are other supernatural beliefs. In Brazil, they're drawn to beliefs in good and evil, but not fate, whilst they show some interest in reincarnation and the idea of a universal spirit or life force. So yeah, Romanticism was yesterday associated with alternative spirituality, and the agnostic orientations we study do shade into alternative spirituality. But whereas alternative spirituality locates existential authority within the individual, and we see that in the language of authenticity and integrity, agnostics emphasize the limitations of existential knowledge, and they therefore undermine the authority of any existential knower, which includes the individual as much as it does the clergy. Any claims to having existential authority are problematic within this outlook. So there is a difference there, I think. Now, again, histories of Marxism and communism would be quite distinct, but are absolutely crucial to understanding atheism, including in the most populous atheist nation on earth, China, as well as its significant history in socialist settings, and emerging research taking different kinds of bottom-up approaches, working inductively with people and discourses rather than beginning with recognised philosophies, perhaps elite philosophies, points to other orientations too. And those include existential or worldview indifference. So that describes those who don't have an articulated worldview or reject the idea of having one, perhaps, who are atheist in the negative sense, but are as far removed from atheist traditions like humanism and agnosticism as they are from the atheist ones, as they are from the theist ones that we've been discussing, or you've been discussing across this symposium. And that population may be substantial in scale. So Pew reported recently that in the US, atheists were more likely than Christians to say they often feel a sense of wonder about the universe. That was 54% compared with 45%. And that supports the emerging view that we should consider atheists believers rather than unbelievers, as we do theists. But it also raises the question of what we're to make of the very large number of people who don't report that experience at all, and in other research don't report having any sort of existential experience. That's an interesting space and quite a different form of atheism to some of the non-religious worldviews that I've talked about so far. So this brief overview of the multiplicity of worldviews associated with atheism illustrates also the challenges of summarising the characteristics of its doctrines, beliefs, values and rituals as we've been working towards in this project. A growing interest in socialist atheism engages with existential rituals and rites of passage developed in the USSR, for example, or in the GDR, as substitutes to religion, and shows how those have had different kinds of success in different contexts. It's been very popular in some. I've already mentioned the development of humanist, existential and moral meanings around Christmas. Many studies have explored non-religious methods of ritualizing death. Studies of socialization into atheism and non-religious traditions, rather than away from religious ones, also uncover the diverse ways in which these orientations are manifest in culture and cultivated in people and shared between people. And there's no scope in today's lecture, in today's discussion, to capture the diverse beliefs, values and rituals associated with atheism. But what we can say, and what I think is important to say, is that they can be captured. So we're now at least very far from what Charles Taylor called the subtraction story of religion that emerges from secularizationist accounts, or in the accounts of many non-believers themselves, whose existential perspectives have been dismissed, naturalized, or both, combinations of which lead to kind of inattention or lack of awareness of the rituals, identities, social relations, and so on, even in one's own life. So the need that follows from replacing religion or spirituality with the existential or worldviews as an orienting framework for our sociological inquiries really is a vast expansion of research exploring humanism and other non-traditional worldviews in their diverse institutional and often individualized and individual forms. So thinking about non-religious worldviews today, what then can we say about their existence in the world today? Well, for now, when it comes to general data on the worldwide presence of non-religious worldviews, we do have to fall back on studies of atheism and agnosticism. Non-religious worldviews are hard to measure, not least because the religion-centrism of the secularization paradigm, as well as theological paradigms, are woven through our culture and therefore our research methodologies, and also because we're not quite clear on what all these worldviews are yet. We're at a very early stage in this way of thinking and these inquiries. And also because the individualized nature of non-religious worldviews in some parts of the world, including Europe and North America and the West, discourages the formation of clear alternative languages and identities. Those with non-traditional worldviews often rely on non-religious language to describe themselves, just by simply describing themselves as non-religious or having no religious, or those who say they're spiritual but not religious. All of these diverse non-religious identities. Stephen Bullivant proposes that the best figures that we have in terms of a global population of atheists and agnostics points to there being about 500 million, give or take tens, perhaps even a few hundred of millions of people, because there are many problems with these data, but let's say 500 million. Presuming their number has some relation to religious disaffiliates worldwide, there's some evidence to suggest that they have a relationship, although it's imperfect. And there's lots of complexities there. Still, the number of atheists would be growing as disaffiliation is. Measuring the unaffiliated gives us another kind of proxy for non-religious worldviews, and those indicate an even greater scale. So the unaffiliated sometimes have been described as counting as the world's fourth largest religion, in quote marks. So we can summarise, here we go, a good summary of the global picture. Non-believers are typically young, disproportionately male and educated, and are most likely to live in Northern Europe, Japan, and communist or formerly communist nations. I think we can say that. Bullivant quite sensibly steers clear of identity-based measures of atheism. The World Values Survey asks a sort of famously bad question about atheist identity, confusingly offering atheism alongside non-religious as an alternative in one of its questions. And anyway, the relevance of identity-based measures is much lesser for existential traditions that have emerged in individualized social contexts and don't have the same traditions of institutionalization as the, quote, world religions that sociologists and others are used to documenting. So it's not that, as Meredith Maguire has taught us, that we need to also attend to lived approaches that pay attention to everyday practices away from, but in relation to existential or worldview institutions like churches, but rather that for these newer existential movements emerging in individualized contexts, those institutions don't really exist at all. This is less true of non-religious traditions that are bound up with political ideologies and institutions, as in Soviet and communist contexts. But even here, atheism is not the central identity, it's the political identity, which I'm so sorry, I've got a small visitor. Can we, out you go. It's like, Maggie, I'm just talking to this room, can you go? Sorry, I've got it's like the BBC moment, an audience appearing. Can you just lift? Okay, give me an ice cream. Can you take them out? So sorry. It is like not quite as glamorous as a BBC moment. Okay, it's quieted down. I was being brought an ice cream, a pretend one. So in Soviet and communist contexts, there are, of course, more developed or formed atheist identities, but even there, the atheism isn't the central identity, it's really the political identity, which may imply atheism, but the political identity is uppermost. So the point isn't that atheists don't have worldview identities, but they are much less clearly codified, and they're certainly less obvious than we would find within a world religions paradigm, in that they don't relate to single existential or worldview institutions. Whilst we can continue to rely on measures of atheism and let's move along there, atheism and non-affiliation as proxies for as proxies for diverse non-religious worldviews, we must turn to these to understand the demography of those populations too. So as we've seen, atheists are described as typically young, disproportionately male and educated around the world. But the demography is really much more complicated than first appears. So Colin Campbell, the pioneering sociologist of irreligion, that was his term, and who was researching and writing at the time of the 1969 conference, he speculated that the demography of non-religion told us less about that than it did about the sociology of radicalism. In the 1960s and 70s, non-religious worldviews were beginning to move towards the mainstream they now occupy, transforming local religious traditions into new non-religious ones. So they began as radical, but drew on longer-term traditions and proved to be widely salient, and then necessarily became less radical in status as they become the norm. So the sociology of radical movements, says Campbell, shows that they're often associated with the privileged in society, since those privileges safeguard groups, the groups that raise their heads above the parapet. It's often the only very so slightly marginalised who lead countercultural movements, marginalised enough to be motivated to look towards something new, but not so marginalised that they lack the means to manage the challenges of going counter to the mainstream. As Campbell suggested, non-religion is losing its association with education and maleness as populations have grown in many settings and coming to resemble local populations. It's lost its distinctive demographic profile in terms of education, for example, in the UK and in many places across Europe. And at the same time, demographic patterns are complex and increasingly complex and inconsistent. So recent research has shown that the non-religious tend to be younger and less well educated in more non-religious countries, whereas in Europe, non-religious populations are older and more educated where they're a minority. So atheist populations may still incline, and non-religious populations may still incline towards high levels of education and maleness in some places, or even overall, but the picture is complicated and it's changing, and that certainly suggests that any association between atheism and those demographics, as Campbell suggested, doesn't have very much to do with atheism itself. None of that tells us specifically about the demography and sociological histories of distinct forms of non-religious worldviews, of course, but I hope there'll be much more of that to come. So by way of a conclusion looking towards the future of non-religious worldviews, we need to certainly expand our empirical knowledge of worldviews in this re-centered sociology of existential belief, practice and tradition, and also return to theoretical questions, including the nature of religious change or perhaps worldview change. The shift in perspective lays emphasis on different questions as we seek to understand changes in this landscape. Are we right, for example, to give so much attention to, as sociologists, to the failure of religious transmission over generations, instead of examining the emergence of new existential cultures like alternative spiritualities and humanisms, and look at their transmission across generations? Perhaps the issue is supply side after all, to use the economic conception of religion, but it's not about religious supply failing to meet demand, but that demand is being met by new suppliers who are achieving some kind of salience in their contexts. I think sociology, we as sociologists need to get much better at accounting for these processes of worldview production and reproduction, as well as decline. Trend making, I think, is complex or even suspect, even as a result of this reframing, perhaps in general. Historicizing atheism as part of diverse existential cultures suggests that those cultures aren't likely to be subject to processes of, to use Berger's term, desecularization per se, but are as stable or as vulnerable as any other cultural traditions. So if we see atheism as a cultural tradition and historicize it, we can think about its fate in that way. It will have the same kinds of stability or vulnerabilities as any other cultural form, be that pop music, social democracy, whatever it might be. In the UK and the US, humanism is underpinned by cultures of evolutionary science, which is over a century old. In communist countries, humanism is underpinned by politics and by party, and those aren't will-o'-the-wisps, but neither are they permanent. Environmental concerns at the moment are kind of offering a critique of humanism that may be its undoing, but just as often environmentalism operates upon humanist logics, as it can do according to religious logics too. Trends suggest that atheism will continue to grow, but we're limited yet in what we can say about how this trend is then passed out into these different worldview or existential traditions. Which ones of these will grow? And then final slide I want to show today. This is a picture of a photo exhibition that we held as part of the final conference of the Understanding Unbelief Research Programme, which was in 2019 and commemorated the 50th anniversary of the 1969 meeting with Rome. And we were able to partner with the Pontifical Council for Culture at that event as well. So a very kind of interesting moment. And what I want to point here is the value of non-binary approaches, to use a phrase that Denise Cush, an educationalist in the UK, has used. So what I think we can say more confidently is that the proposed shift from the study of religion to the study of perhaps worldviews is bringing about a much more decisive move away from binary understandings of religion and the secular. Critical religion approaches associated with Timothy Fitzgerald, Russell McCutcheon, Naomi Goldenberg, and so on, as well as critical secular approaches, who we've mentioned already, Azad, Keane. They've all helped redefine that binary. They've historicized it, and they've recast religion and secularity as social constructs and products of ideology. But they have retained the binary to a great extent in that discussion. The sociology, indeed, and indeed the anthropology of the existential pushes us much further towards what Kush calls this non-binary model, and that I think reflects the emerging empirical research much better. It helps us understand that the contours of European humanism are, as anthropologist Matthew Engelke has shown in the UK, shaped by Christianity, and yet aren't simply examples of Christianity. It helps us understand how people in humanist landscapes come to Christianity and other religious beliefs, often through humanism, and then not dismiss those religious identities as really non-religious because humanism has played a part. That kind of shift away from zero-sum game approaches to theism and atheism, a form of analysis that I think tends a little bit too much towards a kind of tug-of-war, stands to improve our sensitivity to existential configurations that combine, configure, assemble traditional religious traditions with new existentialities and supernaturalist and naturalist beliefs, conceptions and experiences in diverse ways. So since 1969, we've come some way in our understanding of, to quote, the culture of unbelief, to use the title of that conference, and the programme of sociological research that the sociologists at that conference thought would be impossible has established. They just didn't think we could really do a sociology of atheism, and I think at this point that's clearly been proved to be not the case. Atheism itself has receded in some places in the world, notably in post-socialist contexts, but continues to establish itself elsewhere. Identifying as non-religious has been described as the new normal in some places, and the same can be said of atheism too. And yet those observations feel somewhat superficial against the emerging sociology of existentiality or worldview, which I think opens more questions than it answers, but promises very much to. Okay, thank you for listening. I look forward to hearing the responses, and apologies for the interruption along the way.
So thank you very much for this brilliant presentation. And now we discuss with Irena Borowik. Are you ready?
Yes.
But here.
Thank you very much. Okay. Hello, Lois. Nice to meet you. It's a pity that you are not with us. I'm Irena Borowik, placed in the Institute of Sociology at Jagiellonian University. Since many years, I'm interested in sociology of religion, and preparing discussion of your paper, I based, of course, on the writing version that on the one hand was richer, that in comparison to what we were able to listen today, and on the other hand a little bit different. In my short response, I would like to start from 2 points, from 2 premises. Of course, they relate to your very rich view of atheism and all similar concepts. Maybe you and present in this room noticed that in one of the last publications, Peter Berger, who is the most frequently in the last year quoted for his famous removal from the secularization thesis, claimed to introduce a new paradigm in sociology of religion, which he called 2 pluralisms. And the first he understood as plurality of religious beliefs and worldviews. And the second one, what relates to our discussion concerning atheism, as discourse between religious and secular groups. He considered to be the most important feature of the present situation, and was so sure of importance of it that was convinced that this concept replaced his famous and well-known concept of secularization. Leaving aside some criticism of this Berger concept, this was met with criticism. Pollack criticized it, Helm criticized. The basic idea, I think that we agree with the basic idea that pluralism is a major factor of contemporary realities. And that it's related to both, to the social system as such, to the structure of the social system, and to the individuals too. The question is if it's really a new paradigm and in what sense it is new. But that's the other issue. And that's one starting point, one premise. And the other one, in these two contexts, the new paradigm of Peter Berger concept and the other one I want to talk just now, I want to place this array of thinking on atheism that Louis Lee presented to us. So the other context, there is no water. Oh, there is water, sorry. Yeah. And the other context I relate to development of sociological thinking on religion and understanding of religion, conceptualizing religion, which could be seen as alternative thought on religion. Alternative means taking into account that manifestations that were brought into field in the last decades, starting from Luckmann's concept, invisible religion in the 60s, then in his concept, this framework of new religious themes he postulated with its shrinking transcendences, as he named it, through bricolage of Hervé Léger, patchwork religion of Robert Woodnow, vicarious religion of Grace Davie, diffused religion of, sitting behind me, Roberto Cipriani. All these concepts developed in the last decades are known, but I have an impression that in research, especially in quantitative ones, continuously dominate quite narrow concept of religion, mostly associated with its institutionalized forms. And in this research, usually non-religion is measured as lack of institutional religion, lack of belonging, or lack of institutionally defined beliefs. And I read presentation of Louis Lee as a kind of polemic with this understanding of religion as having impact, of course, on understanding of non-religion. Because in majority of ways of approaching atheism and non-religion. As you may notice, non-religion and atheism somehow, almost always, is related to religion. It is why understanding of religion is also important. And in these two contexts, I found paper and today presentation of Louis' papers, Louis Lee, as very inspiring. First of all, she offers, and you offers talking to you, a very rich overview of different phenomena labeled as non-religion, unbelief, atheism, and so on. And secondly, the paper and the presentation shows in a very convincing way growing importance of this phenomenon, which could be supported even more by data showing, and Louis Lee in written form referred to Pew Research Center, to the data showing that accordingly to them, to the Pew Research Center, nuns, that's the other term, nuns means not affiliated, make up 16% of the global population. So it means that behind Christians and Muslims, they present the most dynamic race, and it's also important to think about this dynamic also in the perspective of the future. Estimations, of course, are only estimations, and they are we never be sure. As today told us Louis Lee, Bullivant estimated number of atheists and agnostics globally as about 500 millions. Phil Zuckerman, for instance, estimated the number of atheists, agnostics, and unbelievers from 505 to 700 millions. So a big discrepancy, which also mirrors the fact that it's difficult to measure. And there are different measures used to estimate atheism, unbelievers, and different forms of unbeliefs. Qualitative studies show that picture even is much more complicated. Qualitative studies, to which I come back in the end, putting some questions to our presenter. And Pew recognizes this problem, and they write, measuring atheism is complicated. Some people who describe themselves as atheists also say they believe in some kind of higher power or spiritual force. At the same time, some of those who identify with the religion, for example, say they are Catholic or Jewish, say that they do not believe in God. That's example of that difficulty. And difficulty lies also, I think we partly saw it in today's presentation, by variety of notions that Louis used, referring and linked to atheism, or not being the same, not meaning the same as atheism. American Atheist Research Collaborative Organization on their page put a list of different terms used to describe. It starts from atheist. I'm not going to read all of this. It's 6 lines. I will read only the 2 first lines. Atheists, agnostics, skeptics, freethinkers, rationalists, irreligious, non-religious, non-believers, secularists, secular humanists, humanists, brides, apostates, unchurched, non-church, non-theists, and there is 4 lines more. I'm not going to make you tired. So it's visible how complicated is matter to analyze and to measure atheism, non-religion, and so on. So the first virtue I saw in Louis' presentation given us today and in the paper is making us aware of this variety of different views related or labeled as atheism, but not meaning the same. And the other very important thing, maybe even the most important and probably the most difficult to make a use of it, and maybe it could provoke our discussion, is what I read in presentation on atheism as looking at religion, not religion, distinction, not in a binary, but in a more complex way. I read this as an appeal to all those who work in religious studies and in sociology of religion. I read this element as calling us to think of more sophisticated and nuanced thinking of religion, not only theoretically, but also in research. In a radical implementation, if I'm right, it would mean looking at belief, unbelief, non-religion, religion. That's the question to you, Lois, as a kind of continuum where binary ordering of reality, like sacred, profane, religious, secular, will be forgotten and replaced by more sophisticated worldviews. Is it possible or not? That's a matter of discussion. And the next point I find very interesting and probably the most disputable, and here I place my next question to Lois, is that in this variety of ways in which non-religion, non-religiosity is present, and looking not only at the presentation today, but also at the book, at your book from 2015, I read. In this landscape, Louis Lee places her own conceptual proposal. It is at least how I read it, the concept of existentiality. I'm not sure if I properly read it as a way to meet this proposal to avoid binary divisions in thinking about religion, not religion. I quote from the book, I think, I didn't make a note from the book, not from the paper. There are forms of belief, identity and experience which are analogous to religious ones, which are insufficiently or unsatisfyingly described by other social categories as political ideologies, say, or as leisure practices. I have described this as an existential dimension to human life, society, and culture, necessarily transcendence of existence because it involves forms of perspective taking on its nature. I mean, existentialities and types of existentialities you distinguish, I read as your proposal to replace this binary thinking about religion. Do I have still some time? Okay. So the last part of my presentation so there are two questions to you. I hope you develop in the answer. And the last are some suggestions concerning fields that, in my opinion, deserve to look while thinking about atheism. First, atheism, non-religion, and states policies. I think that states policy is very important, either in preventing atheism or in promoting, in hiding, or in persecution of atheism. And it's important for status of religion, but for status of non-religion too. As we know, communist state promoted and promotes atheism, but confessional states prohibit atheism and prohibit freedom of conscience. And these are important factors to be taken into consideration and also in interpretation of data. Close to it, but not the same, political processes and relation of it to atheism, existence of not only atheist organizations, which was in paper, I think, a little bit better developed than in presentation today. So atheist organizations are important and studying of them, but also social movements and political parties that promote belief or unbelief. And there are some parties strongly promoted Christian, in Europe at least, Christian views, and there are political parties promoting unbelief, that it's important to study this field. The third point, religious traditions and their relation to unbelief and unbelievers. And I think that it's important to study not only doctrine, but also how in a given historical moment, a given religious tradition relates to unbelievers. Is it persecuting, criticizing, accepting? And I'm putting stress on the fact that I'm not talking about doctrinal level, but about social practice, what is happening in reality. The fourth point, recently I read very interesting paper by Davie, who is a Czech sociologist of religion, on atheism in Czech Republic. And it made me thinking that analysis of historical roots of some developments related to atheism would be also very important. Czech Republic, as you maybe know, is the most atheist country in Europe, not Scandinavians, but namely Czech Republic. And he analyzed a specific part of Czech borderline that almost 90% of people are not affiliated. and showed high historical events, namely expulsion of German Catholic population from that region, had an impact on distribution of atheism. So that's just an example, but I think that there is many such places where historical events and past relate to the present. Non-religion and social movements. For instance, Marta Trzebiatowska compared nuns, atheist women from 4 Western countries, showing how declaring of atheism by these women is related to their understanding of gender and feminism. That's a question. What sometimes is the reason for vitality of atheism? Maybe resistance. It is why I think studying relation between atheism as worldview and social movements, for instance, feminism, or for instance, some other resistance movements is important. And the last point, atheism and meaning of religious structure. Years ago, we wrote with Branko Andrzej and Radosław Tyrała together a paper on atheism in Central and Eastern Europe, and we discovered that on distribution of atheism has an impact. It's linked to the religious structure of society. Namely, the most important element was religious pluralism in the countries where was strong dominance of majority religion, as for instance Poland, but also Croatia. Distribution of atheism was at much lower level than in countries with plurality, religious plurality, with not as strong one particular church. So these were suggestions that it's important, in my view, it would be important to develop in research. And 2 questions to you, if you remember which one I asked. That's it. Thank you very much.
So now is for Philippe Portier.
Well, thanks to Roberto for giving me the opportunity to give some comments on the Lois Lee, very rich text. I'm also very pleased to meet her for this session. The Lois Lee papers allows us to make the point about the researches that in the recent period have approached the 2 little known phenomenon of atheism and religion. Her thesis can be contrasted with that of Johannes Quack in a recent article presented in a seminar in which I was the respondent. Quack pointed out the difficulty of working with the notion of non-religious. He considered it too vague and therefore intended to work on its deconstruction. Lois Lee aims to show, on the contrary, the heuristic fruitfulness of the concept. She considers that the category of non-religious is essential to understand contemporary worldviews like atheists, who refuse the idea of God, or like agnostic, who consider it undecidable. I would like to take up Lois' work by recalling her contributions and then by indicating my convergence with her thesis, and finally by submitting some elements for discussion. Roberto, is it possible to stop the echo, because it is very difficult for me to speak? But maybe
we have solved an impossible problem.
Ah, okay. So
We have stopped to work. Therefore, we have added another camera in order to go on.
okay,
Because otherwise, at home, they don't see anything.
okay. So I'm going on. First, the principle of analysis that we can retain from the reading of the paper. At the foundation of the presentation is the idea that the non-religious is a worldview that produces identity and culture, practices and relationships, which, although based on the absence of belief in God, looks like a religious worldview. In another article, Professor Lee summarized her thinking by saying that nouns are not nothings, but they are somethings. This definition of the non-religious as a positive fact is complemented by three main points. For Lois Lee, the non-religious is a massive, a universal, and an encompassing reality. A massive phenomenon first. Sociology has long ignored the importance of the non-religions. Why? Lois Lee mentions a historical reason. Until the last few years, the non-religion did not appear on the social scene. After the rupture of modernity, we have seen in Western Europe phenomena of disaffiliation, of separation with religious institutions. Religious practices have often declined. But, except in the work of some intellectual elites, there were no claims of atheism. The population remained Christian. Lois also insists on an epistemological reason. Following Jim Beckford, she notes that the sociology of religion has, with the paradigm of secularization, been interested almost exclusively in the disappearance of its own object, the religion, without noting that other cultural universes could succeed it. However, over the last 30 years, and in France since the 70s with the work of François-André Isambert, we have seen a recomposition taking place. Many authors have focused their research on the question of the non-religious under the effect both of the social expansion of the phenomenon and of the questioning by sociology of the paradigm of secularization. Lois Lee adds that atheism is also a worldwide phenomenon. Based on the work of Stephen Bellevent, she gives some very significant data on the subject. The world today has at least 500 million of non-religious people. That represents the fourth religion or world vision in the world. For a long time, practical atheism was thought to be a Western production. It is true, of course, atheism is particularly developed in Europe, but Lois evokes many other regions of the world. She points out the incredible importance of the phenomenon of non-religions in China and Japan. She also identifies the increase of non-religious sectors in South America. The analysis leads to this conclusion: non-religion becomes the air we breathe, the sea we swim in, what Charles Taylor called the default option. Atheism is finally an encompassing phenomenon. The author calls for a rethinking of the concept of atheism by expanding its definition. Her investigations, following those of Linda Woodhead, led her to mention two things. First, one cannot analyze the non-religious in a simply intellectual way as a pure system of thought. The vision is that of the thinkers of New Atheism. However, it does not represent the whole social reality. Often, very often, non-religious actors do not have a well-established theory about God. In fact, the non-religious refers to a way of living, what Lois Lee rightly calls an existentiality. It defines a vision of the world that extends into a system of action based first on the sovereignty of the subject, but where contact with the meta-empirical, with the transcendence, can be possible. This possible alliance of the non-religious and the spiritual leads Lois Lee to refuse a binary approach according to which the non-religious is the absolute opposite of the religion. I would like to say now my points of agreement with Lois Lee's thesis. One can approve, of course, seen from France, remarks on the expansion of the phenomenon. There have been phenomena of detachment from the church since the 17th and 18th century in the West, but this detachment did not take the form of a complete disaffiliation. There were, until recently, very assertive declarations of belongings and practices. In France, for instance, in the 50s, 92% of the population declare themselves to be Catholics, and only 4% of the people had no religion. More than 90% of the French people were baptized at this period. Today, the detachment from the ecclesial institution is accompanied by a rupture of all ties with the church. In France, no, Catholics are 32%, only 32% of the population. The non-religions are now 58% of the population. And the phenomenon is likely to increase as there is less and less domestic transmission within the religious people. Obviously, as it is the case in Great Britain, the humanist culture in France has replaced Western Christianity. Lois Lee's analysis of the universality of the phenomenon is also very compelling. The non-religious has often been considered a Western phenomenon. It has been linked to the Enlightenment and a bit later with Marxism. In fact, things are less clear than that. In the countries of the South, there is also an expansion of the non-religious. This disengagement seems to be the result of two factors. It depends on an economic reason. This is the thesis of Ronald Inglehart and Pippa Norris, who consider that the economic, the social, the educational development is at the roots of a detachment from religion, perceptible even in African or Arab countries. But the expansion of non-religions also depends on a cultural factor, sometimes on a juridical factor related to the public system of regulation of religion. At an equivalent level of development, some countries declare themselves to be more religious than others. This is the case in the European countries of the Protestant zone, for instance. In Asia, China has not got the same profile than India, and similarly, Poland is not the Czech Republic. Finally, we can agree as well with Lois Lee's thesis on the complexity of the phenomenon. It is often said that non-religion and religion are mutually exclusive categories. This is not true. The idea of a zero-sum game does not correspond to the situation. On the one hand, religion leaves room for criticism. Religious people today are very doubtful about their own beliefs. They don't believe that their religion is the only true one, nor even that this religion is true. Often, moreover, religious intellectuals also accept not to adhere to the idea of a God of power or truth. In this sense, we can refer to the work of John Capito in the theological field, or in philosophy to the one of Gianni Vattimo. On the other hand, reason can be opened to religion. One thinks of the philosophical thesis of Paul Ricoeur in France, or even of Jürgen Habermas in philosophy. And on the social scene, non-religious people are very far from Hitchens or Dawkins, very far also from the old age communist leaders. They often mix reason and spirituality. The analysis we have developed with Jean-Paul Villem about the French situation show that materialist atheists constitute only 10% of the total number of those without religion in France. I would like now to present some elements for discussions. Lois modestly explains that we need to go further in the research. In that respect, I would like to open 3 lines of reflections. We can stop in the first place on the genealogy of the non-religious. There is a point that the paper does not explain. Why do population choose to opt for the non-religious? What are the reasons for disaffiliations? May we say, and that is the first hypothesis, that this choice has been produced by an internal reason to the churches. This questioning has been developed in French sociology. The ecclesial offer would no longer respond to social demands because the churches, and especially the Catholic Church, are too attached to traditional system of beliefs and practices. This is the thesis of Danielle Hervieux-Léger in her latest book. Or that the second hypothesis, may we say, on the contrary, that the exit depends on a reason external to the churches. Jörg Stolz, in his book, The Spirituality of the Ego, has developed the idea that in the eyes of the people today, secular goods are more desirable than religious goods. More than salvation, our contemporaries would seek health, prosperity, knowledge, leisure, many goods that secular institutions can bring in a more effective way than religious institutions, knowing that the exit out of religious institutions does not prevent them from searching for their own well-being, a certain spirituality. Next, I would like to address the question of the consistency of the non-religious. Lois reminds us that non-religious and religious people do not share the same worldview and therefore the same forms of life. I recently made the following distinction with Jean-Paul Villem with regard to the European distinction. Religious citizens are often marked by an objectivist and ontological morality, which varies, however, according to the level of secularization and to the history of their countries. They are more attached to the traditional family, to the national bond and are more to the right on the political spectrum. They belong also to religious organizations. Non-religious citizens, on the other hand, are driven by a situational morality, often hedonistic, which gives a great place, a very great place, to self-determination on question of family and sexual ethics. They are also less nationalistic. Politically, they are more to the left, and very often they are militants of secularist organization. I would have two questions on this point. Does this distinction seem to you useful to describe the cultural polarization between the two parts of the European population? If you agree with this thesis, does this definition of the non-religious apply beyond Europe? Is it true, for instance, for China's non-religious people? Finally, I would like to address the question of the future of the non-religious. The idea of the disappearance of religion, at least in its institutional form, has been widely defended. This is the thesis of the founding father of sociology. The analysis was consolidated during the 60s, and Stephen Bruce goes in this direction today. Some authors, like, for instance, Jean-Marc Ferry in France or Hans Joas in Germany, are dubious about this thesis of the inevitable progression of the non-religion. It seems to them that there is a contingency of the phenomenon. The era that is opening could give new possibility for religion. They defend this thesis by identifying two closely correlated phenomena in our society. First, they insist on the idea of a second modernity. The idea, which is also defended by sociologists such as Ulrich Beck or Anthony Giddens, aims to show that the first modernity, very optimistic, based on the alliance of the state and progress, has been substituted since the 70s by another model of social organization marked by a very strong uncertainty about the future. The author then insists on the idea of a counter-secularization. This moment of uncertainty gives rise to phenomena of a return to the heavy religious, which we have seen, for instance, in Georgia or in Russia or elsewhere in the form of ethno-religious populism. We can also think of heavy phenomena of accentuated polarization between the religious pole and the non-religious pole of the population. What is your feeling about that? Don't these phenomena lead us to question the idea according to which the non-religious would be the necessary future of our societies? So there are some comments on your very beautiful paper. Thank you very much for your attention. Thank you, Lois.
Thank you very much. If there is question from the floor, we can collect now and after give the response.
Massimo Leone, Bruno Kessler Foundation, University of Turin. I just wanted to ask you, the three of you, if there are some reflections in your work or in the recent literature about technology, which is a little bit my field, digital technology, and the relation between atheism and transhumanist tendencies. Thank you.
My name is Carlos Parra, on sabbatical at Gregorian University from the Foreign Service Institute in Washington, D.C. Thank you for this amazing conference. And I noticed the absence of Latin America, except for Brazil, in the paper. And it would be interesting to bring it up, obviously. And I also believe that this is a visionary conference, Professor Cipriani, and we have had a diversity of voices. And perhaps the next challenge for this field would be also to bring voices from the global South into this conversation. One more thing, perhaps for Professor Cipriani. The Secretariat for Non-Believers, I think it fell into oblivion over the past decades, and thank you so much for bringing that up. I wonder, Professor Cipriani, if under the current pontificate, there might be, in your view, the possibility of restoring that secretariat, and what can you do about it as a Roman insider, perhaps? Thank you.
Yeah, I'm Fenggang. Because the papers are about atheism, and several of you referred to China. I want to say a few words on that. In China, atheism is the required identity for a large proportion of the population. If you are a Communist Party member, you have to declare yourself as atheist. Otherwise, you can lose your membership. And not only the Communist Party, but also the Chinese Communist Youth League. That's for younger people from 14 to 28 years old. You also have to declare to be atheist. And then for elementary school kids, and if you want to join the Young Pioneers, it's like a Boys Scout or Girls Scout. You also need to declare yourself as atheist. As a result, most Chinese, if you ask, what's your religion? They would say, no, I don't have a religion, because religion is a bad word. No one wants to associate, well, few people want to associate with religion. Then they ask, are you atheist? Yes, I'm atheist, because that's what everyone is learned, taught in school, to be atheist. It means to be modern, to be good. But atheism has very shallow roots in traditional Chinese culture. Basically, it's hard to find Chinese classic thinkers who are real atheists. They may not be believing in any religion, but hardly atheists. So when we actually did a survey of religion and spirituality in China in 2007, and we asked people's belief and practice, as well as identity, belonging. And what's interesting is we found that even the communist members, both party members and the league members, 85% of them are not really atheists. They either have some supernatural beliefs or participate in some religious or spiritual practices. So when you try to generalize the proportion of atheists in the population, China with 1.4 billion people, that will overblow the proportion of atheists in the world today. So that's really, we have to keep that in mind when we try to see what's the general trend. This is not only for China. Actually, when I looked at World Value Surveys, it shows like 24% Koreans as convinced atheists. I doubt that, because that's the measure problem. The measure cannot really measure the actual identity. People may say I'm atheist, but they have supernatural beliefs. would you really call that atheist? And for Japan, similar. You may see many Japanese say, I'm atheist, but even a colleague we brought to Purdue University, he wouldn't say he's religious, but when we really ask about whether you wear any religious things, then he pulled out a charm to carry for safety, for traveling, right? So it's that. So I think now the measures have serious problems so that we do not really know the actual reality, especially in East Asia, I would say. All the measures have problems. We have to start from the very bottom, very beginning to come up better measures about religion, about beliefs and practices.
I have just a question.
No.
Yeah, just a question to you. I have just a question to you. How could you explain that in the Japanese statistic, the level of non-religious people is so important? You ask the people, are you atheist or agnostics? They respond, yes, we are. How could you explain that? It is comprehensible for China for the reason you say, but how could you explain for Japan?
Yeah, I guess
Can you
our
reformulate the question? You can reformulate.
I'll reformulate the question. Yeah, the question why even in Japan there's more people say they don't have religion, right? That's a issue of the word, the understanding. Religion is a very new word in East Asia. It's really the Japanese first translated religion into Japanese with two characters. And those two characters did not really exist as a concept before late 19th century. Right? So it's a new concept. And also religion as a translation is more associated with Christianity and maybe Buddhism, but also some new religions that have strong organizations. Mark Mullins can tell you more about that. And in China, China really borrowed the Japanese translation religion into Chinese. And so the religion, the word, is really first appeared in the formal documents by the cultural and political elites. So ordinary people may not really understand what do you mean by the word religion. So say, are you religious? No, what do you mean? What is religious? Right? That basically, there's no understanding for the common people. On the other hand, I do argue that religion has entered East Asia gradually, especially as people get educated, because we learn that religion is one of the social institutions. Religious freedom is protected in the Constitution and the laws. So more and more people do get a better understanding what is religion. But still, there's a level of understanding that varies. As a result, yeah, most Japanese wouldn't say they are religious. But if you actually ask, do you do this? Do you believe this? Many would say, do have some beliefs on the supernatural beings, not the creator God. I think that's another key thing. Atheism is the antithesis of theism. And theism is really mostly monotheism, that about the God creator. If you ask, is there a supreme God that rules the world? I think that concept exists in many cultures. But in East Asian cultures, there was no creator God. So that's made the atheism as there's really very shallow roots in traditional East Asian culture. Maybe Mark can say a few words.
Well, thank you for the opportunity to join the conversation. I work primarily on Japan and Japanese religion and contemporary Japan, and I'm in regular conversation with Fenggang about how, I'm not a survey quantitative sociologist, but we're trying to use qualitative data to come up with better ways to measure religiosity. And the whole notion of atheism doesn't get a lot of press. If you look at the literature and the sociology of religion in Japan, there's not a lot of talk about being a mushinronsha, an atheist. What the term that Fenggang was referring to is mushukyo, without religion. And the way religion is understood popularly is religion refers to having a creed and belonging to an organized religion. So the model is it's either a Christian church or a new religion that has, you have some sort of joining ritual. But for the masses of Japanese who may go to shrines and temples, they don't use the term religion to talk about that. The term is used as shakai teki gire, or social rituals or customary practices, and they don't think in terms of the category of religion. I mentioned a little bit about that when I was talking about Shinto the other day. So survey research has a hard time grasping that. And if you automatically think that if a Japanese says, I'm mushukyo without religion, that means atheism, you're mixing it up. It's not the case. And most even Japanese survey research will look at behaviors and beliefs. And the person who said, I'm mushukyo without religion, the surveys point out that, but they have religious sensibilities. You ask them about what they're doing, they go to shrine temple, oh, I'm feeling a connection with the ancestors. So they are spiritually connecting to the unseen world, which normally we think is connected with a lot of religious activity and beliefs. So real atheists are probably a fairly small percentage in Japan, and even the mushukyo people, those who say I'm without religion, 50 to 70% practice religious activities, either at home or at temple and shrine at different times during the year. So they're not secular. They're simply, we don't use that vocabulary to talk about how we relate to the spirit world and to the ancestors. And so there is sort of this latent religiosity, even they don't call it religion.
So one more sentence. Actually, this I learned from Mark. Now we are also looking at religious sites and shrines, temples, churches. And even though the Japanese, if you do interviews or surveys, they may not say they are religious. But if you count the religious sites in Japan, I think Japan has one of the most dense religious sites. There are 80,000 or more Shinto shrines and close to 80,000 Buddhist temples. Then you have thousands of churches and new religious groups. It's just when you map them on the map, we are doing that. It shows the Japanese are one of the most religious people if you compare the density of religious sites in other countries.
Thank you. I'm really enjoying the fact that the Asianists get a voice in this discussion. So one more sentence about China. When I look at the surveys, I don't even look at the numbers for, do you believe in religion? Are you religious or not? These are political questions, and I'm not interested in contemporary politics. So I don't even look at that. The one thing is important, and the one thing I would really like to see comparative global surveys is the question that is most relevant in the Chinese case, and I guess maybe also for Korean and Vietnamese and Japanese and other cultural areas, is do you believe in retribution? To to me, that's the key point. Not God, not religion, but moral retribution. Is the universe moral or not? Are the good people rewarded or not? Is evil punished or not? And in the Chinese cultural context, that's the one key thing. And you have in China, I think, a minority, but sizable minority of people devoted, you might call them atheists, but I think people would think that the universe is just physical laws. It's not moral. And you have a majority who think that moral laws are operating. And I would like to see the same question asked in surveys in Europe, North and South America, and Africa, and elsewhere. And I think based on this, we could have a really interesting comparative global conversation. Thank you.
Thank you.
Sorry, no, just a short answer concerning the presence of Latin American specialist sociologists. Of course, for many reasons, the cost of travel included. But Raquel Weiss from Brazil is here and yesterday intervened. The Vatican, according to a colleague of mine, is a monarchy based on independent republics. Because, of course, more than 50 years ago, a Cardinal Franz Koenig insisted on the studies of culture of unbelief. Now the Secretariat has disappeared. I don't think that it is possible to have another Secretariat because Predicate Evangelium document has established a new organization. There are many ministries, Dicastero, and there is the Dicastero for Culture that includes many things. And there is the Pontifical Academy for Social Sciences. I have asked many times an involvement of this academy in order to study the kind of things we are discussing here. But every time the answer was absolutely negative. And I have to stress the fact that the responsible of the Vatican Bureau for Interreligious Dialogue sent me a letter saying, we are not interested in this kind of things. This is just for academicians. But on the other side, I have to emphasize the fact that both Osservatore Romano and Avvenire have published articles on this forum. Thanks.
Thank you. I would add an epistemological question. I write it. I would express my appreciation for your very interesting lecture, and particularly my convergence in your proposal to shift from the study of atheism, theism, and religion to the study of worldview linked to the existence of individuals. As you say, this approach can give also a better understanding of secularism and the religious form of life. But there is a question. What is the role of, or the destiny of sociology of religion in your perspective? Disappearance? This is my question. You have the time, 10 minutes to respond to all the questions. So.
Yeah, 10. I keep my comments to 5-10 minutes because I think you have coffee, which sadly I cannot join you. I am was already feeling very sad to not be there, but now I feel really despondent because I would like to continue these conversations with you all. Thank you so much for the responses, the formal and informal responses. That is hugely enriching. I can't speak to them all. I think with the questions that have emerged, or the questions and comments of people coming to the microphone, I think that's a helpful pathway through some of the issues that Philippe and Irena raised. We have such powerful examples across these comments of the way in which atheism, so what I call big A atheism or capital A atheism as a discursive object, an object of discourse, is so significant. And I admit that I pay some within a short lecture to make the argument I made. I didn't give as much time to that as I could do, and I don't at all mean to dismiss that. As is shown, the way in which atheist political identities, the way in which atheism is associated with institutions, political differences across Europe and so on, the way in which it's used and identified in our methodologies, all of this matters hugely, and there's enormous scope for an ongoing sociology of atheism with a capital A. What I think is, though, that we do sometimes get drawn into that way of thinking. I see that happening again. Some of the comments talked about, oh, that's not real atheism and so on. I think at that point, we're letting discourses about atheism shape our own analytic thinking about atheism. And this is where I wanted to draw some kind of distinction. What bar are we using when we say this isn't real atheism or that's not real atheism? And I think my concern is also that it's pulling us back towards these very simplistic and binary ways of thinking. So I think one word I didn't use in my talk and which might be helpful to traverse some of the things coming out is around naturalism and materialism. I think sometimes we're talking about that's not real atheism. We mean it's not as naturalistic. There's not as much naturalism as I want to see in this population. And there were helpful examples across this discussion of the limits of naturalism within atheist populations. So I think that increasing research with atheist populations shows this. But naturalism does matter. So most of the populations that say they don't believe in God tend to be to have less supernatural beliefs than other populations. So it's not quite sufficient to say we still see lots of supernatural belief within atheist populations, and therefore what, they're really religious, or they're really religious in the old way. No, I don't think so. I think there's some change going on. And as sociologists, we know that individuals and societies are complex. I think it would be incredibly surprising if we found that so-called atheist populations were entirely free of supernatural beliefs. I don't think there's anything we really know about the human mind and human experience that would lead us to predict that. So we can have apply a very high standard if we want to find no supernatural belief within atheist populations. I think we do need to attend to places where there's less supernatural belief, and indeed specifically naturalist beliefs, and take account of that. And so to think about the Japanese example and the Chinese example, both of these are really helpful for, I think they're in line with the argument I was making that when we do have global statistics that group atheists together in a simple way, we're going to run into problems because there's so much diversity within that population and what it means. On the other hand, in Understanding Unbelief, the program I've been working on, we thought we'd try and understand these populations that are the product of social surveys in more detail. So we have asked everyone in these different settings, our 6 examples, which include China, Japan, but also Denmark, the UK, the US and Brazil. We asked them the same questions in both surveys and qualitative research, because what we don't want to do is, or what we wanted to question was this idea that approaches to religion and atheism are so different that you can't make any kind of comparisons or think about people and their beliefs in global terms. So we wanted to resist and explore that idea. And actually, with thinking about Japan, I would totally agree that the language is a huge issue around just going in with questions about are you an atheist, are you non-religious, and they have different meanings. But when we do the qualitative work, for example, we do find important and comparable forms of naturalism in Japan. So in Japan, much more associated with agnosticism than sort of strong atheist beliefs. So really interesting kind of commitment to the ideas that humans can't know anything about the nature of existence and so on. It's a really kind of rich cultural space that I wasn't aware of before we undertook this research, and I think many of my colleagues didn't know much about. So important differences, but there are naturalist strains within that. So as it was mentioned, lots of Japanese attend places of worship, but we spoke with people who don't attend places of worship and then feel connection with ancestors. They attend places of worship, but they don't feel any connection with ancestors. And that's still a rich part of their lives. And this is what I mean. So this is going to bring me to some of the helpful things, questions and ideas that Irena was talking about in terms of the proposition that we take non-binary approaches. I think that we can take seriously the fact that these Japanese people, and indeed there's examples across all of the research I've ever done, engage in different kinds of, let's say, religious practices, for all that is problematic, that they go to places of worship. But we should take seriously also that the meanings and the way that they engage in those settings and the way in which they go with people and share that experience with people around them may be different according to whether they feel, in this case, that they're connecting with ancestors or they're not. And there's something comparable to what we think of as a secularized experience of those places of worship that we're seeing in this research. So we can look at that kind of those forms of naturalism without trying to say they're not naturalist enough for us to take seriously. Why do we want to do that? One thing we do in our survey is ask people what religions they belong to, and then we asked these atheists what religions they felt connected to, and we found that quite helpful because of course the reality of lived secularization is not that people disconnect entirely from religious pasts and religious presence. Of course, that isn't what happens. They are just connecting in a different way. And I think we should take that difference seriously. Thinking about asking people about those points of connection seems to allow people to, it allows them to not answer in binary ways. So when we say, do you belong to a religion? Respondents think we want them to say yes or no in some way, that yes, this is my religious tradition, no, I'm non-religious. If we ask about points of connection, practices that are engaged in, and so on, we get much more complicated pictures. But that's not quite the same as saying that an atheist who goes to church at Christmas is the same as an atheist who, as a Christian who goes to church at Christmas, but also upholds the belief, goes to church every week, and so on. There are important points of change. So the ideas about taking a non-binary approach really have that sort of thing in mind. I think there is, the word polemic was used, maybe that's fair, but I think there's a kind of radical pluralization. It's definitely in has some similarities with Peter Berger's more recent argument, although I still feel the call of the religion secular binary in that work. There's still that sense of importance, Irena, that you pointed to, the importance he lends to the relationship between and engagements between the religious and secular, still somehow suggests that there's the most profound fault line when we're trying to understand religion is between the religious and the secular, whereas a more radical pluralist and non-binary approach would say why would that be the case? Why is the difference between supernatural and natural, supernaturalist and naturalism the most important fault line? Why do we find these binaries so important? If you, I always think about populations on at least two axes, and one of them just cannot be even a spectrum. One of them is just about cultural variation. It's like if you are thinking about forms of music, you don't want to line up rock music and pop music and classical music on any kind of spectrum. What are the two poles of that spectrum, you know? And we might think about beliefs in that way. We might have humanism, Christianity, all of these as modes of ways of life, as modes of living, as forms of existentiality that don't obviously belong on any form of spectrum. But we might then want to consider a spectrum in terms of how important any of those are in anyone's life. So we can have a second axis that says, I connect with Christianity, but I don't care much about it. My beliefs are a humanist, but I don't participate in it very strongly, and so on. And in fact, that second axis could be populated with all kinds of things, practice, all kinds of things. So that's to reiterate. Certainly, I don't know if that elaborates or explains the sense of the non-binary approach, but there's definitely a strong resistance to the idea of there being kind of real atheists and so on. There are worldviews, there are complicated cultures and structures of belief in the world, and some of them are more marked by naturalism than others. And I think we need to take the naturalism of those beliefs seriously. And in terms of the fate, I love this question about what then is left for the sociology of religion within this vision. I mean, I hope this vision is one that's very supportive of all the activities that go on in the sociology of religion. I've compared it to that shift from thinking about in terms of gender, a focus on women's studies, and then all of a sudden a greater recognition of masculinities as constructions, and therefore we don't want women's studies departments in our universities. We're going to need broader frameworks in which we can understand women and as well as men, and then also an array of non-binary positions. And from that point on, we start to see gender studies departments instead. A similar comparison can be made with focus on civil rights and Black culture that then broadened its scope to consider race and ethnicity in broader terms. And I think for all the diversity of this global population of atheists, with a capital A, and indeed naturalists, the diversity of naturalist belief systems, we can make the same. We can say that they are large in number, and they matter in people's lives, and they matter in terms of the political distinctions that Philippe pointed to in Europe. They matter in terms of the institutional questions that Irena raised, which I think are incredibly significant. They matter in all these ways, so we do have to take them seriously. How do we then sit them beside the study of religion? And that's where I see Anne Tave's call that we replace, her interest is in religious studies being replaced with worldview studies. But I think that's the same move, and it's one I've called for previously in my work as well. But it in no way eradicates the study of religion. In fact, I think it shores it up in contexts where secularization is happening, because what you otherwise see is a sense that cultures that are called religious become increasingly marginal, including in our universities and including in sociology. When you say those who aren't identified with religion have a stake in this area of study, a personal stake, it's not just the study of the other, I think you have the scope to reinvigorate it and make clear its significance for the longer term. What that area is called, I think, is an important question for everyone to be engaging with. So worldview, no one actually raised issue with the language. I think there's lots of issues with the language. the historian Todd Weirs talked about worldviews and how that fits into kind of clash of civilizations type narratives. It's a noun. This is my worldview, that's your worldview. It can really discourage complex ideas about complexity and non-binary thinking. He also points to problematic histories of that term, and also it's really cognitive. So while so many of us in the sociology of religion have said this is not just about belief, it's about all of these other aspects, this language maybe is pulling us back to our view of the world and cognitizing how we think about what we're looking at. This is why I prefer the existential, but I think some of the same issues arise, and it's associated with existentialism and European ways of thinking and so on and so forth. So that the language requires scrutiny. I don't think we've landed on our gender, our broader term that will help us make connections. But I think the attempt to do so is profoundly significant, because it sort of levels the playing field in important ways that helps us understand a much greater complexity in the way that people experience the nature of their existence, and that is manifest in our cultures, in our politics, and so on. There's no way in which I could address all the different things. I've been writing extensive notes, and it's been a really interesting discussion, but I hope that's attended to some of them. And yes, if I wasn't riddled with my children's illnesses or earlier in the week, I would be very desirous to continue the conversation with all of you now, but I hope to do that by other means. At least it's been incredibly illuminating listening to your comments. Thank you very much.
Thank you very much to all, and now
Coffee break.
Coffee break.
20 minutes.
Okay.